Good morning, committee members. The clerk has advised me we do have a quorum. Those appearing virtually have been sound tested and have passed. With that, I will call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 138 of the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills, Social Development, and the Status of Persons with Disabilities. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House of Commons rules. All witnesses have completed the required sound verification test. I would like to remind those both in the room and appearing virtually, you have the option of choosing to participate in today's meeting in the official language of your choice. In the room, interpretation service is available, translation by using the headset. Please choose the language you want to participate in before the meeting begins. Those appearing virtually, click on the globe icon at the bottom of your surface and choose the official language you wish to participate in. If there is a breakdown in translation services, please get my attention by raising your hand, and I will suspend while it is being corrected. I would also like to remind members, for the benefit of translation services and the interpretation, to please now check all your devices, make sure alarms are turned off on them, because this can cause damage to the interpreters when alarms go off or buzzers go. As well, please avoid from touching the microphone boom, as it does cause popping in the sound system, which is harmful to the interpreters. As well, please wait until I recognize you. If you need to reach me, simply raise your hand and I will recognize you by name. Those appearing virtually, use the raised hand icon. We do have a couple of additions. We welcome back Madame Vienne to committee, and we have Mr. Cormier and Mr. Mendocino appearing virtually. With that, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on October the 8th, the committee is, no, that's not where we're at. Sorry, just a moment. Pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, September the 25th, 2024, the committee in its first hour is resuming a study of Bill C-378, an act amending the Canada Labour Code. We have witness. I would like to welcome our witnesses, Mr. Nicholas Thompson, appearing President, Chief Executive Officer, Black Class Action Secretariat, appearing in the room. Welcome, Mr. Thompson. And appearing virtually, Monsieur Jan Morin, criminologist, groupe d'aide et d'information sur le harcèlement au travail de la province du Québec. Each of you have up to 5 minutes. We'll begin with Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee. My name is Nicholas Marcus Thompson, and I am the President and CEO of the Black Class Action Secretariat, which is a non-profit organization that is committed to dismantling systemic barriers within our public services. I also lead the Coalition Against Workplace Discrimination, which unites unions, human rights groups, and civil society actors to address workplace inequities across Canada. My expertise is further informed by my experience as the former president of the Union of Taxation Employees, where I applied the Canada Labour Code to advocate for federal workers in workplace safety and addressing harassment and discrimination. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak on Bill 378. I want to begin by saying that myself and my organization supports the proposed amendments to the bill to extend the period from 3 months to 2 years. While the proposed extension is necessary, focusing solely on this change leaves the complaints process largely ineffective. And I'll explain why, in our view, that is so. Even with an extended time frame, the current framework fails to deliver justice or accountability for victims. The complaints process focuses on workplace restoration rather than justice for victims. Investigations culminate in recommendations but impose no consequences on individuals responsible for harassment or violence. There's also limited value for former employees. For former employees, an extended time frame does little to address the lack of meaningful outcomes. Even when complaints are upheld, there are no provisions for compensation, apologies, or any form of redress. So I could imagine, as a former employee, participating in a process that has no benefit to me at that stage when I've already left the workplace. Without mechanisms to hold individuals accountable or address the root cause of harassment and violence, systemic discrimination persists, particularly affecting Black, Indigenous, and racialized workers. So to make the extended time frame meaningful, it must be accompanied by structural changes that address the fundamental flaws in the complaint process. So I propose the following reforms. Introduce a referral mechanism for disciplinary action. One, and that is investigations that confirm harassment or violence should automatically trigger a referral to a disciplinary body. Employers should be required to impose corrective measures, including retraining or other disciplinary actions to ensure accountability. Number two, provide restorative outcomes for victims. The process should include provisions for financial compensation, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, or apologies, which it doesn't provide at the moment. These measures would reinforce the seriousness of workplace harassment and violence and provide meaningful redress for victims. And finally, to strengthen support for marginalized workers. Specific programs should be developed to address the unique barriers faced by Black, Indigenous, and racialized employees. This includes culturally relevant training, outreach, and tailored assistance to ensure equitable access to the complaint process. In closing, the proposed extension to 2 years under Bill 378 is an important step forward, but it does not address the systemic barriers that makes the complaint process ineffective. Without accountability for wrongdoers, restorative outcomes for victims, and tailored support for marginalized groups, the process will continue to fail those it is intended to serve. So I urge the committee to not only support this bill, but also to take this opportunity to implement broader reforms to the Canada Labour Code to create a framework that delivers justice, accountability, and equity in workplaces across Canada. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Monsieur Morin, la parole est à vous pour 5.
Mr. Morin, you have the floor. You have 5 minutes. Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today and for taking the time to discuss such an important subject as harassment in the workplace. My name is Yann Morin, and I work for the Groupe d'aide d'information sur l'harcèlement sexuel au travail de la province du Québec, also known as GAIHST. I hold a master's degree in criminology and have been working with the organization for 10 years. We were founded in 1980 specifically to raise awareness of sexual harassment in the workplace. In 2024, our organization's mission is deemed to help people who are experienced or have experienced harassment in the workplace, be it sexual, psychological, or discriminatory. We strive to empower the people who contact us by offering information and support throughout their personal or legal processes. We work mainly in Montreal and surrounding areas. but anyone in Quebec can access our services. Our expertise lies primarily with non-unionized workers in small and medium-sized businesses in Quebec, but we also support unionized workers in large corporations. Essentially, our services consist of counseling, listening, legal information, and technical support for people experiencing harassment in the workplace. In some cases, we can also provide accompaniment and representation in legal proceedings. Finally, we offer education and awareness-raising services for the general public. Today, I hope to be able to pass on to you our expertise based on our direct experience with these people. In 2018, we were able to give our opinion on a similar issue at the request of the Quebec government. At that time, Geist proposed extending the time limit for filing a complaint of psychological harassment from 90 days to a minimum of 6 months. Since then, we have revised our point of view following the increase in the time limit for filing a complaint to 2 years. This change has clearly demonstrated the importance for victims of having a more generous time frame in which to take action. In our experience over the last years, a 2-year time limit seems to be much more in line with victims' needs. One explanation for this need is the significant consequences that the actions in question have had on people. We still find that the majority of our clients are on sick leave following the events, and that the end of their employment will be close to or during their sick leave. In view of the consequences for their health, these people need more time to be able to initiate complaints or other procedures. Generally speaking, the people who come to our organization will have a diagnosis of PTSD, major depression, or an adjustment disorder. As an example, the NIMH sums up the reality of people developing PTSD. Symptoms generally appear within 3 months of the event, while some people may recover within 6 months of the onset of symptoms. Many will need a year or more to do so. Whatever the medical diagnosis, these people are rarely able to take action in such a short space of time. In our experience, with a 2-year deadline for filing a complaint, we find that few of the people who contact us find it difficult to initiate a complaint within this time frame. In recent years, we have only rarely had to explain to a victim that the deadline for filing has passed. Many people who contact us manage to file their complaint between 1 and 2 years after the harassment. However, when it comes to claims for employment injury, which is 6 months from the onset of the illness of non-sexual violence, we continue to maintain that the time limit should also be 2 years. We regularly have to inform people that their 6-month deadline has passed when they first contact us. This also echoes a recent study by me, Rachel Cox, who had access to CNESST statistics on claims for sexual violence and discovered that the most frequent reason for a refusal was that the claim had been made out of time. We therefore support this proposal to increase the time limit to at least 2 years in order to improve access to recourse for these people who suffer enormous consequences for their health, their professional lives, and their personal lives. There were some complaints that were mentioned by my colleague, and I would mention that there are legal steps that exist in Quebec but do not exist in the rest of Canada. I feel that this could be very beneficial for the victims. Thank you very much.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Morin. Ms. Vien, you have 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming this morning to talk to parliamentarians about this very important bill. It's very important for me because I'm a sponsor of this bill. And why is that? It's because I wanted to align what was being done in Quebec when I was Labour Minister with what could be improved here at the federal level. Mr. Morin referred to that. Mr. Morin, you were involved in the process in 2018 when we had public consultations on that bill. Contrary to popular belief that politicians lack vision, well, at the time, you had a recommendation to move forward with increasing the time frame from 3 months to 6 years, 6 months rather, and now we're up to 2 years. So it shows that Quebec was quite open-minded at the time. And that is the situation that I find myself dealing with now when I look at former federal government employees who are governed by the federal charter, are limited to 3 months. where some others don't have that time limit. Mr. Morin, you obviously agree with the 2 years. We're very pleased to see that there is agreement on that. Could you perhaps give us a list of what harassment or violence in the workplace looks like so that everyone fully understands what we're talking about here? Thanks for the question. I'd say it's really quite broad because harassment can include a number of actions. There are some psychological effects. There can be insults. It can be denigrating someone. Let's say someone works in an office tower. Well, someone may have to be working in the basement instead of on the 33rd floor with his colleagues. So harassment is a very broad term. It could be psychological. It could be physical. It could be assault. It could be punching. There's also sexual harassment that is included in this general term harassment. There could be this unsolicited invitation for sex, unwarranted sexual comments, or there could be sexual harassment in the workplace. As far as discrimination is concerned, I think my colleague is in a better position to talk about that than I am. But there is systemic harassment that can exist. It can be just small aggressions, but it can be much more serious than that, and repeated actions as well. So the consequences can be very harmful. Thank you, Mr. Morin. Let's talk about these major consequences that you mentioned in your presentation as well. Obviously, you mentioned PTSD, depression. Basically, those people who experience harassment or violence in the workplace what kind of problems do they experience after these events? Well, it varies from one person to the other. Generally speaking, I mentioned the most frequent side effects. Those were the symptoms related to those events. Obviously, there's going to be a psychological effect. There's depression, loss of interest, difficulty to get up in the morning, trouble with self-care. There may be eating disorders. They may have trouble cleaning themselves. They may have all sorts of other problems. So they may have a lot of trouble going over the events as well that led to these symptoms. They may experience nightmares. There's also the whole aspect of anxiety that is very obvious. They may have self-doubt about their professional skills, loss of self-esteem. There are also physical consequences that stem from what happened. They may have stomach aches, headaches, difficulty eating, difficulty functioning. And with all of those symptoms, there may be a serious illness that happens that could have an economic effect as well. So obviously, this will also have consequences on family life and a couple's life. I have the feeling that my time is running out very quickly, but just a word about the impact. Well, there isn't much talk about those. There's an impact on the businesses as well. There was a look at this by a major organization. They said there was a drop in the quality of services, absenteeism, staff turnover. Do you agree with that? sometimes it's thought that it's just the victims who are the ones who are suffering an impact, but it affects the businesses as well. Yes, there are obviously effects on the businesses, and you mentioned some of them. When you have people who are living in a harassment-based workplace, there is an effect on productivity. When you have people who are off on sick leave, then there's a loss of productivity. Very often, people who go off on sick leave do not come back to the same job. They have to be retrained. So there is all sorts of fallout for the businesses. Thank you very much, Ms. Vienne. Mr. Coteau.
Thank you to our witnesses. I want to first talk about just the workplace restoration versus justice you mentioned. What is the difference between the two? Can you explain that a little bit more for the committee?
Sure, thank you. So the intent and the way the legislation is written, it focuses not on blaming anyone or holding anyone accountable. What it seeks to do is to find out what went wrong and to provide recommendations to restore the workplace. Very broad, so no one is held accountable, and it's not a deterrent to change behavior.
So give me an example of that, like an extreme example, if possible.
Sure. So I participated in a process where a third-party investigator came in, found that there was wrongdoing, found that there was workplace violence, that a senior leader had perpetrated against a worker, and the recommendation was very broad, which was training, which was the issue had involved sending an email in the workplace. Very broad training to all employees about email etiquette and about privacy. So nothing towards addressing that issue with that employee, just very broad for everyone.
So I know you can't speak of specifics, but in a case where someone is threatening someone in the workplace, you're saying there actually is not a process in place to hold that person accountable?
Not through the Canada Labour Code. The employer may look at activating a procedure through their code of conduct or their directive on discipline. However, through the Canada Labour Code or its regulations or under Part 2, it does not mandate any type of referral mechanisms. There isn't that. So if the employer chooses to look at it through this process and not through any other, it's optional for the employer to determine which process. So if an employee files a complaint through this process, then it means to say that they'll go through that, and you can't hold that employee, anyone accountable through this process legally.
Right. I want to just thank you for the advocacy and the work you've been doing, throughout your history of work. And, I think it's important to bring, to improve systems in general. And I know you've done a lot of work around racialized Black, Indigenous communities. How does, you mentioned that it impacts communities differently, and you actually said that there should be some, I think it was some special measures put in place. I think it was the third recommendation to really address these issues that impact different communities differently. So can you go into details about what that would look like?
Sure.
Yeah.
So the data clearly shows us, and the experience of workers clearly identify to us that that different groups face different barriers in the workplace. And, for example, fear of retaliation would be heightened for certain groups. So my third recommendation is to have specialized training, specialized programs to support these types of marginalized groups, to support them through the complaint process. Firstly, these processes are very bureaucratic. when you look up at these processes, it's almost you're David, and the process is Goliath. It's a very challenging process to go through. The length of time, the employer oftentimes doesn't provide you with all of the information, so they know the full back end of how the process works. They're only showing you a little piece. You're not fully aware of it, and for all workers, I think that creates barriers. But when you are in any of these racialized, indigenous, or black groups, you're already facing additional barriers within the workplace. So to make the process more accessible, there could be programs to support employees in these groups to navigate these processes.
You're probably familiar in the Ontario government when these issues came forward back maybe 2016. There's a group of mostly women who came forward with allegations of harassment within the system, and they did put in special measures. One of them was because of that complaint process you're talking about, the challenge of actually going through it. They made a provision. It was the Secretary of Cabinet who made a decision that complaints would have to go directly to him for that special category because the system itself wasn't allowing people to flow in the right way to get to where they needed to be. There was too many barriers they felt in place. Is it that type of those types of accommodations that you think, like, looking for different ways to put in some alternative measures to address those issues?
Sure, I think. So these issues are over decades, over a long period of time.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the solutions are temporary solutions.
Right.
So these recommendations ought to be institutionalized within the processes. And over a period of time, it should make it better and better with amendments like these that are brought forward. But
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate your time.
Madame Chabot pour 6 minutes.
Madame Chabot for 6 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our 2 witnesses for their presentations that seem to support the bill that we are dealing with. The Bloc Québécois, my party in Quebec, is also going to support this bill that strives to increase the time frame to 2 years. In the Canada Labour Code, it said 3 months. So it will be 2 years for all complaints related to harassment and violence in the workplace. In Quebec, the initiative was already taken. We are often at the forefront of improvements in the workplace. Certainly some events might inspire us, but I must say that my colleague at the time was Minister of Labour when I was actually working for the unions when we made these amendments to our legislation in 2018. Mr. Marcus, what you are saying is very interesting to me. You said that you supported this legislation. I would like you to make a comparison between Quebec and Canada, but in terms of Part 2 of the Canada Labour Code that referred to complaints in the cases of harassment or violence in the workplace. MPs have to have some training as well as business leaders. Would you say that the Canada Labour Code, as it is currently drafted, with its investigative steps with regard to the support systems that are available to the victims, is sufficient, but do you think that we should add other provisions in order to strengthen that part of the Canada Labour Code?
A member for the question. I think I got it. It was a little bit long. I support, and my organization supports this amendment. We think it would go a long way. But we also are calling for other measures to support the investigation process, to enable investigators to provide recommendations that are beyond the present scope that would effectively provide individual remedies to the situation that goes beyond restoration but goes into the justice and accountability framework. And that is the basis of our recommendations that's before you today.
Parce que actuellement,
Because it doesn't exist right now? When it comes to the role of the investigators? There are no provisions that allow what you are mentioning in terms of accountability and redress?
That is correct. The present legislation under Part 2 and the regulations does not enable a third-party investigator to make such. They are only allowed to make a finding of whether there's workplace violence occurred or not, and what the broad recommendations are for the workplace, not directed to any individual. And that system presently upholds the systemic issues. It allows wrongdoing to go unchecked, and it doesn't allow for individual accountability. And that entire system is why, in part, why we have organized and have filed a class action against the entire federal public service, 99 departments and agencies, because of the ineffectiveness of the current mechanisms, including those in the Canada Labour Code.
merci.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of the other witness. Sorry about that. Mr. Moret. Okay, thank you. In Quebec, you defend the rights of workers, sometimes in their battles. Sometimes they suffer physical, sometimes psychological damage. Is there anything in the Quebec legislation? I'm sorry, I'll repeat. In the Canada Labour Code, could other measures be taken to reinforce this, apart from extending the deadline, the time frame that you have to file a complaint? Thank you. I agree with what Mr. Marcus said, and that is that in Quebec, yes, there is this internal investigation process. There's an investigator who can make recommendations, but there aren't any obligations. Indeed, for the victim, there isn't really anything there. The recommendation is to improve things in the workplace. So very often an employee cannot return to the former workplace. Especially if you have a non-unionized worker, they would have to file a complaint at another organization. And then that's where you can find some redress so that there is some justice rendered for the damage caused. And you can also have your file cleaned up, and you can get compensation for loss of salary, for example. There could be also punitive damages imposed on the employer who may have acted in bad faith. Thank you, Mr. Morin. I'm sorry your time is up. Thank you, Ms. Chabot.
6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much to the witnesses today. And I'm going to start with Witness Thompson, and I thank you for the work that you're doing to really shine a light on the reality of workers in the public service, and certainly it's going to to really help any workers that work for federally regulated industry. So I wanted to go back to the words you spoke about accountability, and I'd like to just revisit justice and accountability as two missing points in this bill and the opportunity that it presents here to have them added. So given your knowledge with the basic return on investment that an employer receives by putting forward taking all the risk. They're moving forward with all of the risk, knowing that there's rarely justice and accountability. I wonder if you could just share if this is deterring workers from reporting harassment in their workplace experiences.
I believe that it is in our experiences, and as a union representative representing many workers, it has, when you share this process with workers, it's oftentimes, well, what's going to come out of it? And the fear is almost often that nothing will come out of this. No one will be held accountable. I would not be made whole again. The process feels very performative for many workers.
So just to follow up on that, I wonder if you could share with this committee some of the losses that those workers experience, not just monetary, but what are all of those losses and risks that they can potentially experience?
Sure. The biggest loss that workers experience is the mental health, the physical impact. I've seen workers who go home and take this, especially when you work from home. Previously, you'd go home and you'd take it home, but when your home is your workplace, you live with that trauma, the impact on your family. That's a huge part of the experience of workers when it comes to workplace violence. And it makes it even worse when you're experiencing this in your home. You have no safe space to go, no place to you can't leave it in work and come home. A lot of workers are, working remotely. So I think that the mental and the physical, the mental health aspect, it leads to physical illness as well. That accounts for a major obstacle for workers. And I think every Canadian should be very concerned, because these are the workers that are showing up and providing you with public services, are working injured. These injuries are very real, and the impact on these workers are tremendous. So Canadians are not getting full production. Canadians are not getting services at the level that they should be when you have a worker who's showing up, could barely get sick leave, or when they are able to perform, it's not at the capacity. And you as MPs would get feedbacks from your constituents of the services that you're receiving and that they're receiving from the public service. So no one is winning when there's workplace violence. No one is winning.
Thank you for sharing that. And, just thinking about this bill, so this bill is going to maybe make it to the House of Commons, onto the floor, maybe not. But I think what you're talking about has to be addressed. Obviously, you're taking action through legal action, which is very expensive, very costly. There's no way that an employee could do that work on their own. So I thank you for that. But what can this Parliament, as part of this report, recommendations could come out of this report that don't necessarily need to be caught up in the delays that the Conservatives are causing in the House right now in regards to protecting workers? What could we do now to help as parliamentarians?
I often try to figure out, why do we have so many inequities in our public service? Why do we predominantly have one group in the leadership and others all below that? And it dawns on me that members of Parliament who pass the legislation often it's not a priority. It has not been a priority for parliaments to ensure that these barriers come down. They're often enforced and reinforced by Parliament. So Parliament has played a critical role in reinforcing systemic inequities throughout workplaces that the bureaucracy then enacts. So this body plays an important role in dismantling these. And these recommendations that we've provided, presently there's no accountability for executives in the public service on these issues. It's not tied against their performance. It's not tied against anything. It's, their actions are optional. It's performative. And they're enabled by legislation that says that you have to do this, and they're able to check that box, and that's it. They present numbers to the Parliament that they're doing extremely well. And that's not the lived reality of many workers throughout the public service. And accountability is what these recommendations are calling for, and that's what you can do.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson and Madame Zerillo. Mr. Siba, Madame Vienne pour 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you once again for your presentations, witnesses. Mr. Morin, I would like to discuss a very specific matter here. That is the time frame. Right now, former employees have 3 months to file a complaint. We would like to increase that to 2 years to give former employees to do that. Right now, there isn't any problem for current employees, at least at the federal level. On the surface, you know that 3 months isn't enough. We all know that. It's obvious. But in reality, could you give us some examples of trauma or specific situations that were experienced by former employees whereby they recognize that something happened, but the 3 months has already elapsed? I imagine that you have federal government employees who are under federal jurisdiction who go to see you. But very specifically, how much time is required to recover from a trauma to a point where this 3 months isn't enough? Well, I will give you just one example. Let's say someone who, I know someone who had psychological trauma, and she went into major depression. Before she actually managed to contact us, it took 6 months, if not more, because after the events, after the termination of her employment that ensued, the woman took everything in her power to just get up in the morning. She didn't have any support to actually, feed herself. She had no support. So most of the day, she just slept, tried to meet her basic needs, and when she did manage to get some support, to get some antidepressants, well, that took 4 to 8 months. It takes 4 to 8 months to actually have for these drugs to have any effects and be able to function normally. So just as she was getting out of the slump, she said, "Oh my God, something is happening. Something happened to me in the workplace, and it wasn't right." So Jan, she came to see me. "Jan, Mr. Morin, is there anything that we can do?" It took her at least 3 months to actually get some control over her life and get out of the house. And then it was impossible for her to take any steps. Even right now, we just have a 6-month time frame in which to make any medical claims, and that had elapsed as well. So yes, we decided that perhaps that we could file a complaint based on what happened to you, but now we can have 2 years. And then in writing, we're going to ask her to write down her experience. So at that point, we're actually asking people to relive what they experienced. And it was already very difficult at the time, let alone to repeat it. All right, I just have 1 minute left. Well, I'll close on this. I don't know if we'll have time for a third round, but Parliament, the government, in its regulations, has tried to include something that shows that the argument of 3 months is insufficient because the Parliament has given the opportunity to former employees to file a complaint after this 3 months has elapsed. But to go back to what my colleague Ms. Chabot was saying, it's up to the fighter to actually go through all of this. They have to prove that there was trauma experienced. You have to prove that you weren't able to actually file a complaint within 3 months. Then you have to provide documents, maybe some medical records, maybe some notarized statement. Unfortunately, I don't have time to list all of those things, but I think that there is a very strong argument in favor of passing this bill, and that is that even parliamentarians have provided for an additional amount of time to file a complaint because the 3 months could be insufficient. And in fact, that is what you have just said. That's what you are seeing on the ground. Thank you, Ms. Vienne. Mr. Fragascados.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Premièrement,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I think this is an excellent initiative by Ms. Vienne. We have discussed this. We discussed this after our last meeting. This is an excellent example of a private member's bill. Sincerely, honestly here. Secondly, Mr. Morin, what has been Quebec's experience with this issue? Because at our last meeting, Ms. Devien talked about Quebec's experience. There is the same piece of legislation in Quebec, as you know. So what has been your experience in Quebec? Thanks for the question. I'm not sure I really understand what experience you're talking about here, Quebec's experience. What exactly do you mean? I understand that in 2018, the Quebec government passed the same legislation with a 2-year time frame. Do you have any opinion on Quebec's experience with this legislation? Yes. I'll give you an example of what happened on the ground. First of all, I started working with people who were victims of this prior to 2018. We don't have official statistics, but when we dealt with someone who didn't have any rights because the time frame had elapsed, it's very traumatizing. So I would say that before the changes in 2018, it was constant. Every week there were people who came to see me and I had to say, I'm sorry, the 90 days have passed. But unfortunately, I don't have any solution for you. And after the change that was made in 2018, between 20 and 24, the number of times I've had to say that, well, I could count those on one hand. I'm not going to say that there haven't been more cases than that. Yes, there are some people who need more than 2 years, but in our experience, it hasn't happened terribly often. With the 6 months, we've already seen that a lot of people need more time than 6 months. There was an adjustment period between 2018 and 2020 that was somewhat complex because The legislation was not backdated. It wasn't grandfathered. So we were still dealing with the 90 days. But once the legislation was passed, the people tried to file a complaint again, but they were refused because when the event happened, it was the 90 days that applied. It was difficult for us to keep statistics because of that. But once things stabilized, we saw a clear improvement with regard to the number of people that we had to turn down. Thank you, Mr. Morin. So if I understand correctly, you are all right with the 2 years? Perhaps that is reasonable. Yes, there was reference to 3, maybe 4 or 5 years, but I think 2 years is reasonable. That's what we discussed at the last meeting. We discussed why 2 years instead of 3, 4, or 5 years. What is your opinion on that? I think I understand, but for the committee, I think it would be a good idea if you repeated it. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Yes, I'm obviously here to defend the victims' rights. I'm very open to getting 3 or 5 years. There are always people who would need that. That would be a step in the right direction. But you have to look at the pros and cons of a decision that could have effects. In our experience, we think that 2 years is reasonable. It seems to work well in Quebec, at least in our experience. Yes, there are some exceptional circumstances that would require more. When we help people deal with the legal challenges, if it's more than 2 years that have lapsed since the event, the less the likelihood that they will appear credible. So I could say that 6 months definitely isn't enough. 2 years seems reasonable. We would agree in Quebec and Canada that perhaps it should be more. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Fragiscaros. Ms. Chabot for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you. Mr. Morin, here in Canada, the Labour Department tabled a report in 2021 acting against harassment and violence in the workplace. It was tabled in 2023. We looked at the complaints in the public service. It would appear that it's Crown corporations and the public service that are among the 6 worst offenders. We don't know how many complaints were rejected because the time frame had elapsed, but we did look at the number of the complaints that were filed. There were a lot of them. Given your presentation, you're saying that we are going to see a huge difference in the number of incidents if there is a longer time frame to reject a complaint. Are there any statistics available for Quebec? Do you have the number of complaints that were rejected after the time frame had elapsed? I'd like to be able to answer your question, but it's difficult to get statistics. I'm not a professional researcher. I don't have access to confidential data. I just have access to the public ones. It's difficult to really understand the reasons. It's generally accepted that we have a database on harassment, but generally there aren't any statistics on the refusals or the reasons for that. The best I can provide you is a study by Rachel Cox, who looked at the need for more statistics and more help. There are various reasons the complaints were refused. They're not necessarily available to the public, but it seems that sometimes it was because of the 6 months. But there are other reasons for refusal, that are problematic, and these are often based on the lack of knowledge of what harassment and violence in the workplace is. For example, there might be things like if somebody wore a skirt to work one day, that could be considered inappropriate or harassment in the workplace. There's incidents like that. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Chabot.
2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and it's really a good segue into data collection. And my question again is going to be for Witness Thompson. And last meeting that we had on this bill, there was talk about data collection and more data collection, and I had some questions to the sponsor of the bill about the risks of privacy when it comes to that data. And so I'm interested, Witness Thompson, is data collected now? And how do you feel about data being collected around complaints? I mean, obviously they would aggregate it or should, but we know human resource departments are notoriously known to be the least confidential office in a business often. How can we protect privacy if there's data being collected? Is data being collected? And also, does data collection present a new risk, especially for marginalized groups?
Well, I think I'll share with you what I think first on whether data collection should be part of this. Data helps to inform a lot of the decision making on these processes and what the outcomes are and whether it's effective or not. But the confidentiality in the process must be safeguarded. So aggregating outcomes and not specific situations, I think that would be helpful in terms of understanding what are the repeated issues happening, why it's happening, and to look at the root causes of that for accountability for an organization. If an organization is able to identify that they've had hundreds of these complaints and this was the recurring theme, from that perspective, they may be better positioned to have a change in workplace culture. But that has to be protected in terms of who the complainants are and what their experiences are, particularly on their journey to recovery. I don't have the answer to you on the collection of data presently or if that is mandated.
Chair, could I ask that we would request that? I'd like to get some data around what's being collected right now in regards to workplace complaints in federally regulated and the federal public service.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll last question to Mr. Seaback. You have about 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So the current government actually tried to make some changes / improvements on this through a bill called Bill C-65, where they would allow the victims of harassment to apply for an extension and explain why they needed an extension. To me, that seems like almost re-victimizing the victim. Mr. Thompson, I wonder if you would comment on that, and I would say the same thing for Monsieur Morin.
Thank you, Member Seaback. It is the Bill C-65 has made some progress in this entire framework, but that time frame extension is still subject to the employer's approval. It's a, I would say, subjective process, and it certainly does, because now you have to go back and find all of this information, and you're often not given the benefit of the doubt, and the employer holds the hammer to sort of, to crush you. So that's why this is important, to make it very clear that there is a 2-year period, and it removes the subjective decision making from the employer, and it gives those who face oppression in the workplace a little bit more time. Especially, we know my colleague there, Mr. Morin, spoke about the 6 months, and it's 6 months to 18 months for trauma recovery, and even longer for some people. So imagine going through that trauma and then having to come and justify yourself and to find documents and to make that representation. It's simply it even adds and exacerbates that
Yes.
trauma.
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Seebeck and Mr. Thompson, merci, Monsieur Morin. That will conclude the first hour of today's meeting. I want to thank the witnesses, and we will suspend for 3 minutes while we move to the next motion. Meeting suspend for 3 minutes. Members, we are back in session with the second hour. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on October the 8th, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of workers in the seasonal industry and the employment insurance program. I would like to welcome our witnesses, Monsieur Pierre Laliberté, Commissioner for Workers, Mr. Alan Melvin, President, Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture, Mr. Brody Berrigan, Senior Director, Government Relations and Farm Policy, Canadian Federation of Agriculture, Mr. Philip Mondor, President and Chief Executive Officer of Tourism Human Resources Canada. Monsieur Pierre Liberté, we'll begin with your opening statement for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thanks for the invitation to speak to you about this topic. Of all the EI topics and the problems with that, I would say that the treatment of seasonal workers that are in the outlying areas, mainly in Canada, is no doubt the most pressing matter, and the one that is most symptomatic of the EI program. It's symptomatic of a broader problem, but it really is quite extreme with this category of workers. Basically, the problem comes from the fact that the parameters of the program have not been adjusted since 1996, which was the major big reform. I'm talking about the benefits here. The benefits are available for someone who can determine what they are entitled to depending on the number of hours worked and the employment rate in their area, and the rate that they contributed to the program. In 1996, when the table was established, there was one region in Canada. There was one EI area in Canada that had 6% or less unemployment, where people had to accumulate 700 hours of work to qualify for a minimum of 14 weeks of benefits. Now it's 39 regions that are in that situation, 39 out of 64 regions. So nearly 60% of workers find themselves in a situation where they used to have 700 hours of work behind them. I would say that that is at the heart of the problem. Another one is the fact that there aren't any adjustments depending on the regions. Since 2000, there have been no adjustments made despite the changes in the labor situation. The programs, especially in Quebec, have not adjusted to this fact. The effect has been that there has been a hidden reform of EI that stops a lot of workers to get access to EI, or have a lot more trouble doing so because it's much more difficult to qualify for it for most of the workers. The good news, however, is that the unemployment rate is dropping. But maybe that's why it's more difficult to get the benefits. The problem is that the drop in unemployment rate is not always a sign of economic health. In some regions, it is the case. There is an increase in the number of jobs and everything's going well. That's in some regions. Right now, I'm involved in meetings that take place in Rimouski, in outlying regions, Lower St. Lawrence, the Gaspé, to talk about this issue of seasonal workers. These are unionized or community workers, and there is a desperate need for those communities to have these workers. So my head is actually buzzing with everything that I've just heard. But let's get back to the unemployment rate as a sign of prosperity. Let's look at the Gaspé region. There has been a drop from 17% unemployment to about 7%. One used to have 420 hours of work to qualify for 32 weeks of EI. Now, that same person who would work for the same job and the same employer would have to work 630 hours of work to qualify for 14 weeks of EI, which is not enough to get through the dead period. I could give you other examples, other parameters, but if you want to talk about the best weeks to work, etc., I could certainly go into that. But basically my point is that for a number of regions, and not just in Eastern Canada, the devitalization of the regions is such that all unemployment is dropping, not because there are more jobs. There are 1,000 more jobs than 10 years ago, but there are 7,000 people who left active employment. That's why the unemployment rate dropped. It's not because there's a prosperity boom. It's because of other changes. I could certainly go into that in more detail, but thank you very much, Mr. Laliberté. Mr. Melvin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Alan Melvin. I am the president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Agriculture, but here today representing the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. I'm a sixth-generation vegetable farmer in Kings County, Nova Scotia. The CFA is Canada's largest general farmer organization, representing 190,000 farms across Canada. The CFA's mission is to promote the interests of Canadian agriculture and agri-food producers and ensure the continued development of a viable and vibrant agriculture and agri-food industry in Canada. The Canadian agriculture and agri-food sector generated $150 billion of Canada's gross domestic product in 2023 and contributes significantly to the well-being of Canadians in both rural and urban Canada. However, like many other sectors, agriculture is facing a chronic and increasing labor and skills shortage. Some producers are facing acute seasonal needs, while others require labor on a year-round basis. These positions range from field work, harvesting fruits and vegetables, to piloting highly advanced farm equipment that continues to evolve at a rapid pace. The most recent statistics from the Canadian Agricultural Human Resource Council, also known as CARC, identified over 98,000 job vacancies in the agriculture sector in 2022, over 28,000 of which went unfilled in Canada's sector by year's end, costing $3.5 billion in lost revenues. These unfilled positions remained despite Canada bringing in over 70,000 temporary foreign workers to fill vacancies in a wide range of agricultural occupations in 2023. The agriculture sector needs the temporary foreign worker program and seasonal agricultural worker program, which account for upwards of 20% of the total employment in the sector. These workers pay into EI but rarely draw on EI, as oftentimes when employment ends, they head back to their home countries. There are several factors impacting the growing labor shortage in Canadian agriculture. For example, fewer family farms in Canada can meet their labor needs solely through family labor due to growth in the size of the farm operations and demographic pressures, such as an aging workforce, increasing the need for non-farm labor. At the end of the day, the lack of available labor to meet the sector's diverse needs, both seasonal and year-round, represents one of the most significant constraints facing the competitiveness and sustainability of Canadian agriculture. In terms of measures to support the needs of seasonal employment, the Government of Canada should ensure that the employment insurance system does not create disincentives to workers that would prevent employers from retaining skilled workers or undermine the viability of seasonal industries. Historically, the unique skills required by many agricultural operations places an onus on on-the-job training and other informal educational approaches, such as, for example, online education modules produced through CARC, workshops held by equipment manufacturers, and other non-traditional educational arrangements. These sector-specific training opportunities have not always been eligible for EI-funded support, despite the crucial role they play in retention during less labor-intensive seasons. We're concerned that the reduction in funding available under the Labor Market Transfer agreements will make this problem worse, especially in Atlantic Canada, in the Atlantic region. For example, given the remote and rural locations of many farm operations, the travel and accommodations needed to participate in in-person activities can be prohibitive for many farm employees. Finally, it is our view that employers need to maintain oversight and input into the use of any funds generated through payroll deductions, and that those deductions remain earmarked for initiatives aimed at achieving their stated outcomes. At the end of the day, we are of the view that the EI program is a critical tool to support the temporary income replacement needs of workers. However, we need to ensure that it does not create disincentives to work for seasonal workers, supports the unique training needs of employers in seasonal industries, and is used to support programs that benefit the employers and the workers who pay into it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Melvin. I'm sure there will be questions. We'll now go to Mr. Mondor for 5 minutes or less. Mr. Mondor, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Committee, for this opportunity to speak with you today on behalf of Canada's tourism industry. The tourism industry employs just over 2 million people, which represents about 10% of Canada's workforce, with work in over 274,000 businesses across Canada, with employment in nearly every riding. The sector is highly diverse. It's comprised of 5 industries, with the types of jobs that cover the complete career span. It's a wide spectrum. We have jobs that require no Canadian work experience or proficiency in one of the official languages, for example, and we also have jobs that require highly specialized credentials. It's important to appreciate that the services provided by these workers are essential to Canadians and not just to the visitor economy. 30 to 35% of the workforce are youth, most getting their first foothold in the labour market through tourism employment. New Canadians represent about 30% of our workforce. Permanent, full-time workers account for nearly 70% of the workforce. In 2023, 12% of the tourism workforce was seasonal or temporary, and 6% were casual workers. This is the percentage of seasonal workers is down about from 20% about a decade ago. The recreation and entertainment industry has the highest percentage of seasonal workers within the 5 that we represent at 24%. This is largely indicative of the nature of that sector, which includes a lot of Indigenous tourism, outdoor recreation and entertainment, followed by the accommodation sector at 15% and food and beverage services at 7%. Now, I want to note that seasonal workers may include workers that work for seasonal operations, which are open for limited periods, but they also include year-round operations for those that need workers to help address influx or high-demand periods. Many seasonal tourism operators have expressed the need for an EI system that provides supplemental income to help sustain their workforce in off-seasons. This primarily concerns rural and remote operators, of which there are many, most of which are small, medium enterprises. In many cases, these tourism businesses are the economic and employment anchors in their community. Without them, the communities will see a further migration of the population to larger centres. Workers that are able to access EI as supplemental income in off-season help keep these people in those rural and remote communities. So it's important not just for the employment needs of tourism businesses, who most often are the single anchor employer in the region, but EI is essential to sustaining populations in those areas. The tourism sector is not fully recovered from the pandemic. It's taken 5 years to get back to the 2019 levels, which was just in September of this year, but this falls short of meeting the needs. For example, this past summer, we had a shortage of 177,000 shortages. Today, that's about 181. There are many impacts or consequences of not having workers to meet the demand. Lost revenues, for example, without the necessary skilled workforce in the tourism, Canada is losing about $11 billion annually in potential revenue. Business closures, reduced ability to compete, reduced productivity and service standards, reduced investment, innovation. It's all tied to not having these workers. Last summer was especially difficult, and incoming months will be more difficult. Reduced quotas on temporary foreign workers, and incidentally, we only have about 1% of our workforce is made up of that, but reduced international students and the hours they can work has added further constraint to the industry. Other factors impacting attraction and retention in rural areas include housing, transportation, care services, and even internet connectivity. I mention this because it's important to think about the broader context. EI is one tool to help our businesses retain workers at a time when other options are simply not available. A well-designed EI system can complement the needs of our seasonal businesses. Further considerations to policies that enable seniors to work without penalties or clawbacks on their pensions, or for people with disabilities to work without clawbacks on their disability benefits are needed. Enabling international students to work an additional 10 hours per week can make a big difference for our industry. These are examples that may not be feasible, but they're all examples that can help our employers fill job vacancies in their seasonal needs, especially in rural and remote areas. I would be remiss if I don't mention that with respect to EI, Restaurants Canada, which is one of the main national associations in our sector, is advocating for lower EI premiums from 1.66 to 1.57% to offset cost. In the first half of 2024, bankruptcies in the food service sector increased by 55% over 2023, and that's not telling the full story. Many businesses are shuttering permanently or underperforming locations without declaring bankruptcy. So to summarize, EI benefits are helpful in keeping tourism businesses afloat in rural and remote areas. In fact, they're essential. The diverse nature of our sector and the regional and sectoral differences suggest that EI premiums and policies need to be sufficiently flexible or tailored to the regional needs. And finally, a holistic approach is needed to ensure that policies and programs are working together to optimize the workforce. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mondor. We'll begin with Mr. Seaback for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Laliberté, I heard your opening statement and your talk about the different zones that exist with respect to EI. I had the opportunity to be out in Newfoundland and Labrador in the early fall, and while I was there, I had some time to meet with FFAW and their president, Dawn Street. And one of the issues that came up with the fishers out there is exactly these zones that take place. So you could have two people working on a fishing boat. One person is only going to require a certain number of hours in order to be eligible for EI, and someone on the same boat who lives in a different part of Newfoundland and Labrador has a different hour requirement. And so there seems to be, for that industry, there's an inherent unfairness in two people working on the same, fishing vessel having, different requirements for eligibility for EI. I'm wondering if you understand sort of the rationale for that, and if you've, questioned the government about the impact that this has had on fishers, particularly on the East Coast.
Well, thank you for the question. Well, this dates back to the 70s when the program was redesigned, and the notion being that, of course, this being a big country, the situation is not the same all over, and that, in a sense, the generosity of the benefits should mirror, the state of local labor markets. And of course, this is a eminently imprecise science when you try to sort of draw boundaries. We use census data to do that, and census divisions. But it's always extremely awkward and unsatisfactory. There are two issues here. One is access, and then one is the quality of the benefit once you have access. And I think the case for making access the same all across Canada is just overwhelming. It shouldn't matter whether you're in Calgary or in Toronto or in Yellowknife. If you lose your job and you have 420 hours, say, you should qualify for EI. Now, perhaps the benefit can depend on the local labor market conditions, but at least when it comes to access, it should be same. And I think that would take care of at least half of the problem that FFAW members were referring to. Now, I mean, we can have a philosophical discussion as to whether we should have the same old duration for the entire country or not. I think there are good arguments on both sides, but I think on access, it would simplify the life of everyone, including the administration of the program, incidentally, to have someone start with the same sort of yardstick, and then. So I don't know if that answers your question, but
it helps. Thank you. So, are you aware of the particular circumstance that's going on in Newfoundland and Labrador right now, with the fact that the snow crab market's down almost 70%? So, fishers out there are at real jeopardy of not fish harvesters are in real jeopardy of not getting the required income, to get benefits. And if you are aware of it, I know I have, because I've been out talking to these folks. I'm not sure if the government's aware of it, because it doesn't seem like there's much action on this. Have you raised this issue at all in your capacity with the government to suggest that something might need to be done to, help our fish harvesters on the East Coast?
Well, on the issue of access, most absolutely. I mean, in fact, you can be sure that, I was one of the first person that was made aware of the problem when it took place. And it's our task, it's our duty to relay this to the government as diligently as we can. And the nature of the problem that hit, the industry, being the way it is. EI is just a poor kind of policy or an incomplete policy response, let's put it that way. But it should be part of the response. And unfortunately, what we got out of this was the pilot project in 22, and that did not really do the job when it came to certainly addressing this.
I hate to do this. I'm going to interrupt because I'm going to run out of time here shortly. If you, as you say, you were aware of this and you made the government aware of this, can you provide for the committee, if you made the government aware of this in a document or a memo, could you provide the committee with a copy of that memo so we could have that as part of our committee report into this?
I'll be pleased to do that. I need to check because sometimes I do convey stuff verbally.
But if you did put it in writing, you'll send it in to us.
Indeed. If that happened, I will make sure I send it to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Seebeck. Monsieur Cormier, pour 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are for Mr. Laliberté. Since we're talking about zones, you know that every 5 years we have to review those famous EI economic zones. Do you participate in that review, or do you provide your recommendations for the review of those boundaries for economic zones? Thank you for your question. Yes, indeed. Because it is the commission that has to do this review every 5 years. That is in the legislation. That is mandated by law. We've been doing it since 2000, but our recommendations have not been retained by the government. So, yes, we try to do something, but have not been successful. We are intimately involved in the analysis with the departments. Obviously, it's the departments that do the professional and technical analysis. But there you have it. But the good news is that most of the regions are still fairly well assessed. Well, that was my next question. I know that my time is limited. We could spend the entire day discussing this. But we know that you met with a number of groups, some of them in my riding near Bathurst and others in the Quebec region. Some people are suggesting that the changes be such that some of those zones become smaller. There should be a small zone, for example, that represents the Acadian Peninsula. What do you think of those proposals? And is it realistic to think that some small zones like that could change the admissibility criteria for EI benefits, or would it be totally disadvantageous for some regions? Because if you reduce the size of one region, what are other regions going to think? They're going to say, well, I'm not included in that smaller zone. But we have to be fair to all other regions in Canada. Do you think it's realistic to have smaller regions with do you think you'll get enough statistics that really represent the unemployment rate? This isn't an easy exercise. But for Restigouche-Albert, because that's a region that you're talking about, indeed there was a proposal for some amendments, because since 2000, everything that goes on around Moncton has expanded. And indeed, the people who live in that part of Restigouche-Albert are intricately related to what's going on in Moncton, but that's quite different from what's going on in the northern part of New Brunswick. There would be a way to make adjustments, but I would say that we can't increase the number of small zones of population. If we're going to create a zone for Charlottetown and one for Prince Edward Island, they set a precedent that we could use to create smaller zones. I know that we'd have to check this, what's going on in PEI. That would be for another time. But if you look at all these different zones and regions, I know there's a lot of focus put onto that. If you look at the calculation method used to determine the unemployment rate and the number of active workers, if you take the number of unemployed divided by the active workers times 100, well, there have been a lot of changes in the past 10 and 15 years. In fact, there are a lot more older workers. There are a lot of people who retired. Don't you think that that skews the unemployment rate in a region like mine or elsewhere in Canada? Don't you think? Well, yes, I think that the zones can be reviewed, but don't you think that we should look at this calculation for the unemployment rate that may no longer reflect exactly what is going on in some economic zones in Canada? What do you think of that method of calculating the unemployment rate? Well, we've raised this topic quite often with the department because, indeed, the unemployment rate isn't necessarily a clear indicator of a good situation. As you say, it could just reflect the devitalization of a given region. You're entirely correct with regard to the numbers. The active population has dropped, which means that there would be a drop in overall unemployment rate in the region. But it's a question of testing different methods. You could have amended unemployment rates that might include people who are outside of the active population, that type of thing. I don't want to go into detail, but that has to be tested. We also have to see to what extent Statistics Canada could help us. My last question is the following. I have 30 seconds left. There are already 13 regions in Canada that are deemed regions where it's predominantly seasonal work. Do you think those 13 regions are still valid, or do you think there should be others added to that list of economic regions that are based on seasonal workers? Well, let me give you the best example I can find. That's in the north. They're isolated regions. Even if the unemployment rate seems to be 5%, it's impossible to move from one little village to another. That's the reality. Thank you. Mr. Cormier. Ms. Chabot. 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses. Mr. Laliberté, thank you for coming today. And thanks to everyone else, of course. You're the Workers' Commissioner For seasonal workers, I think that you are also in a position to clearly identify the problems that have been mentioned by the seasonal workers. You've been able to do so for quite some time. As you said, the workplace situation has changed. Our EI system no longer meets the needs of those workers. I think it's important to talk about seasonal workers because that is the topic that we're dealing with today. There are industries that hire virtually only seasonal workers. That's the reality. In other industries, they might be businesses that don't work year-round, but the region needs those businesses because they provide some economic input. So how can we support those workers who don't work year-round while at the same time having an EI system that is such that these workers don't fall into the black hole, don't fall through the cracks? We heard a very nice testimony this morning and one 2 weeks ago from Ms. Simmons, who works in the processing plants, who said that in some places seasonal workers represent 60% of the workers. So I think that we have to look after those workers. We have to look at admission eligibility criteria of 420 hours. I'd like you to talk about the increase in number of weeks of benefits that has been raised. Oftentimes there's reference to 35 weeks based on the 12 best years of salary. Do you think that would be a winning solution to keep those jobs and for those workers? Thank you for that question, Ms. Chabot. Well, look, if you ask the question right now as to what the major problem is, well, the major problem is access. There are people who have trouble qualifying. And what I heard this morning from different groups is that we're creating a system whereby workers are getting older and the young people, because they're going to have periods without any income during the dead time, move to a different region. So that destabilizes regions and devitalizes certain regions. Some of them have to resort to foreign workers or foreign seasonal workers. So we've created a vicious circle that is very harmful. So if you have 420 hours for everyone, that would be a good start. As for seasonal workers, well, they would generally work about 15 or 16 weeks. So do the math. That's why this number of 35 was raised a number of times, because that would enable the people to get enough income to cover the dead time. So that would allow those people to survive that period. So I think that if you change the entire table for all beneficiaries and also include seasonal workers who work in areas where the problem is more serious, then I would say that it really depends on which approach you want to take. Is it going to be a universal approach or a targeted one? But bear in mind that 35 weeks is important. Right now, under the pilot projects, it's only 5 weeks. If the pilot project allowed for additional weeks, up to a maximum of 35 weeks, in other words, if somebody qualifies for 26 weeks and could get an additional 9 weeks, but no more than that, then there would be a possible solution that would be targeted, but that would certainly help. And then your question about the best weeks. For seasonal workers who work maybe 14 or 15 weeks, who now have to have this denominator of 22, then if you take 14 or 15 divided by 22 times 0.55, then you can see that the number of weeks that weren't worked is 0. So that means you drop a benefit by about a quarter, if not a third. That doesn't help. So if you just have a general guideline of the 14 best weeks for everyone, that would be good. Thank you, Mr. Laliberté. And Ms. Chabot. Now we'll move on to Ms. Zarillo for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank the witnesses for being here today. And my first question is for Witness Melvin, and it has to do with the acute seasonal need. You raised the acute seasonal need. So I'm interested in your knowledge and thoughts on the EI divisor as it relates to acute seasonal workers, how that workforce has changed demographically over time, how the technology has changed, and what are the unique training need for this specific class, the acute seasonal worker. And then how has climate change affected the acute seasonal worker and even the timing of the season?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And I may bring in Brody, Mr. Berrigan, for some of this, but just a high level, we have approximately half of our workforce in Canadian agriculture is seasonally employed. Approximately 70,000 of those are temporary foreign workers, so coming from overseas, from other countries. So we do have an ongoing shortage that we fill some of that with the temporary foreign worker program and seasonal agricultural worker program, but there still continues to remain a gap. And so we have organizations like the Canadian Agricultural Human Resource Council that is, researching this and trying to come up with solutions on how we fill that gap. And some of that is training, broadening the scope of what's allowed to be provided as training under the Type 2, I think it's called the Type 2 EI program, and Mr. Berrigan can probably speak to that. But, basically broadening the scope of those opportunities to allow folks to remain in the industry and upskill themselves while they're, outside of the regular work season. But I'll turn it over to Mr. Berrigan quickly.
Yeah, thanks, Alan, and thank you for the question. And there were a number of parts of that question, so I'll try and touch on each one quickly. I would just echo the point that Alan made around our reliance on the temporary foreign worker program within the agriculture sector. The reality is that in agriculture, we are faced with ongoing and structural shortages year over year. It's just not going away. And we really rely on that program to fill a critical gap. We've seen that really supported, I would say.
And just a question on that. Sorry I've only got 6 minutes. Are any temporary foreign workers eligible for EI?
All temporary foreign workers are eligible for EI, as well as all other social benefits and worker protections that are available to Canadians. They're treated identical in that sense.
And so then can you just talk to me a little bit about how the EI divisor might affect a temporary foreign worker disproportionately compared to a permanent resident or a Canadian?
Well, so if I understand your question correctly, I mean, it's really about accessing a number of insurable hours. And the reality for a lot of seasonal agricultural workers in Canada that come in through the temporary foreign worker program is they come here to work and they put in 60-plus hour work weeks. And the vast majority would be eligible for employment insurance, even at the top end of that threshold, given the number of hours that they put in. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I just wanted to make sure that there was some coverage there, but I also was just interested in the divisor because I know that is something in the acute seasonal need that we hear about.
On the training side, because I do think that is an important part of the question, and Alan certainly referenced that, I think there's a few elements to that. So wraparound supports, we hear that from a lot of our members and employers in the agriculture sector, including things like transportation to and from training facilities or to training opportunities, employment counseling. Number two, I would say broadening eligibility, as Alan said, looking at other types of non-traditional training activities like short-term certifications, online-based training and workshops. I would say increased awareness of training opportunities and greater emphasis on job matching for off-seating is critical. You also mentioned technology, and I'm really glad that you did. That is a very important part, and certainly something that we're seeing a lot of agricultural producers across Canada adopting technology. Canada has a very high adoption rate, in fact, of technology in the agriculture sector. However, the reality is that certain types of agricultural production, you can think of a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, in particular strawberry picking is typically an example that is used. The technology is just not available at scale and at a price point that makes it easily accessible and something that most producers can adopt, which is why there is still an increased reliance on the temporary foreign worker program to fill that critical gap.
Great. And then just on the climate change and maybe the season edges, like how has climate change affected the acute seasonal need and worker?
Yeah, so there's no doubt that changes in the environment and the increasing incidence of extreme weather events has had a significant impact on Canada's agricultural production. You're seeing that across the country. Droughts, wildfires, excessive rain, floods, hurricanes, and farmers really are at the coalface, so to speak. They are on the front lines of climate change, which is why we at the Canadian Federation of Agriculture have been calling for increased support in our risk management programming to support farmers adapt and respond to these incidents of climate change. Most recently, we've called for the government and stakeholders to get together and have a disaster relief summit. Let's get all the players around the table and have a conversation about how we're going to fill this gap, because our current suite of programs is not responsive to the increasing incidence of extreme weather events across Canada.
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Zarrillo. Ms. Gray, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. Mr. Mondor, Tourism HR Canada commissioned a survey on the perception of tourism as a place of employment in Canada, which found people currently working in the tourism sector are more likely to be under 30 or to be students. But we also know that youth unemployment in Canada continues to rise. Young Canadians struggle to find their first job, which could be seasonal or part-time, through many regions. And tourism has historically represented many young Canadians' first jobs. So has the impact of inflation, debt servicing costs, ongoing tax increases hurt tourism businesses to the point where they're finding it more difficult to hire seasonal and or part-time workers?
Thank you for the question. There's a lot of elements built into your question. And just for point of clarification, the industry itself, about 30-35% would be youth. That's up to 35. The rest are older and look like the most of the general population. But to your point, yes, the inflationary pressures and other dynamics around that have certainly impacted what's happening in the sector. The protracted recovery from the pandemic is still very much impacting the industry itself. Many of these businesses are micro and small businesses for which their cash flows are still very tight and their revenue or their profit margins remain very limited. And as a result, they incrementally are trying to do hiring, but they're limited at the scope of which they can do so, despite the demand for their services. Even this past summer, to give you an example, 20% of the rooms available in hotels across Canada were simply not made available because they did not have staff to serve those rooms. Similarly, with restaurants, the number of hours were reduced by 20 to 40%. And, again, many restaurants were closed. And so the story goes in every case. So the economic situation is really an impairment today in order for them to bring back people. If I can add that one program that is helping illustrate how much of a difference it makes is a government-funded program that's helping subsidize students in employment for summer periods. That example, the take-up on that is in high demand, and that's again, I think it just is an indicator of one of those stressors that you're indicating.
Great, thank you. And that's the Canada Summer Jobs Program?
It is, yeah. And I also, I have to add that program is really fundamental. The point I made earlier, too, might be worth restating here, and that is that, in the end, these are very community-based exercises that we're concerned with. That's how the businesses will look at their workforce. And in any given community, particularly in the rural and remote areas, they are stressed for demands and on those workers. The youth population has been shrinking. The demand for those workers has increased by every other sector. The protracted recovery means we have less access to them. So, the blend of having to tap into other workforces matter.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Mr. Chair, I'd like to cede my time over to Mr. Aitchison so that he can speak. Thank you.
Not quite 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thought you were going to say you weren't quite sure about that idea, but, I'm okay with that,
No,
too.
I'm totally comfortable with that idea.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I wanted to move a motion that we've put on notice. I'll read it for you. It reads, given that, in order to save Canadians up to $50,000, reduce mortgage payments by $2,200 every year on a typical home, and build 30,000 more homes every year, the committee report to the House its recommendation to remove the federal GST on new homes sold for under $1 million. Mr. Chair, this is, I don't think a surprise to anybody. It's been on notice, and, when the cost of a home on average across the country is 30% government charges and fees, I think this would be an important move for the federal level to lead by example, to get other levels of government to reduce their charges and fees on the cost of a home as well. When you think about 30%, you got people borrowing money to pay their government charges and fees. Portion of their home purchase would be borrowing money, especially if they got a CMHC insured mortgage, for example. You can imagine that's pretty crazy. So we think this is actually a really smart move. It's a way of leading by example, and we think that we should report this to the House. So I would like to move that.
The motion is in order, so it is on the floor. Witnesses, this is Mr. Aitchison is in his prerogative to move this motion, which is in order. We have to deal with it before we can return to you. Mr. Fragascatos, you had your hand up. I don't see anybody else. Mr. Fragascatos.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Witnesses have taken the time to be here today. I think we should show them the respect of giving them time to put comments on the record on an important study that Ms. Chabot has championed for a long time. And with that, Mr. Chair, I move to adjourn debate on the motion.
So I have a motion to adjourn debate. What's still record a vote on the motion, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Fragascatos?
Yes.
Mr. Cormier?
Oui.
Mr. Collins? Yes. Mr. Coteau? Oui. Mr. Medicino?
Yes.
Mrs. Gray?
No.
Mrs. Falk? No. Mr. Seaback?
No.
Mr. Aitchison?
No.
Madame Chabot? Oui. Ms. Zarrillo?
No.
Yeas pour 6-6, nays contre 5-5.
Debate is adjourned. We'll now move to Mr. Cormier for 5 minutes. You have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur Laliberté. Je vais
Thank you, Mr. Laliberté. You were talking about a uniform system for all of Canada. You were talking about 420 hours divided by 14. I can understand fully what you mean. For the last 9 years, I've been saying it's not necessarily the eligible hours that are the problem, because if I look at a sampling of my riding in the processing plants or other tourist attractions, there are a lot of people who have to apply for EI with the pilot projects with this extra 5 weeks. I know that's coming to an end, and then the 4 weeks additional time that we hope will be renewed. As you said earlier, there is nonetheless the dead season, so we have to cover that. For me, the biggest problem, that is what the problem is, the reduction of their benefits every week. And also, if you look at the pilot projects, they are talking about additional weeks. So you have to look at this clearly. There are a number of businesses in my region that are also looking for workers after the tourist season or the fishing season or hunting season, whatever it is. So how could we reach a middle ground between the two? And the complexity of changing the zones and the formula and all that. For me, there would be an easy solution. We already know that with a pilot project with 4 or 5 extra weeks, which people can get the benefits. For example, it's the people who've working in the same seasonal job for years. Those are the people that are going to have access to it. Couldn't we create a category, maybe others? In other words, if you're a seasonal worker, you will have a certain threshold to be eligible compared to other industries. For example, if you're in a seasonal or tourism job, or if you're in another job, do you think that this would be an effective way to make it simpler for some people to apply? Everywhere I go, what scares me is that rural regions are emptying, but they are part of our economy. Just like the automobile industry in Ontario, for example. I have 18 fish processing plants in my region, and they are very important. Do you think that we could make some minor changes without having all of the administrative burden so that those people could more easily qualify? That's an excellent suggestion. As you know full well, to qualify for the pilot project as a seasonal worker is to show that in the past 5 years, they have had to resort to EI and sometimes twice in the same year. It's an awkward system, and it's a method that ends up excluding some people that you want to keep in your region who could work in those industries. But in fact, they can't qualify as a seasonal worker. So to have what you are suggesting would be perfect, because then there would be some motivation for those people to avoid being laid off. I think that would help a great deal with the administration of these programs. The other result would be that seasonal workers who are there after the season, let's say somebody who works in the agriculture sector, well, that person could have a temporary job during the quiet time and then come back to the seasonal job without being penalized, because right now the burden of proof is on the beneficiary. If you take one job, let's say a part-time job for 10 hours a week, if it is permanent, well, the assumption of the program is that, okay, you're leaving a permanent job to work at a seasonal job. So you could be disqualified. That's prejudicial. That's unfair. The workers in that area are fully aware of the fact that they're running a risk. So instead of encouraging them to try something new, they're being discouraged from doing so. Thank you, Mr. Cormier. Ms. Chabot, you have the last question. You have 1 minute. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in the remaining minute, Mr. Laliberté, I'm going to admit to you that there are all sorts of possible solutions to support our economic regions that rely on seasonal workers. there have to be some changes. It's up to the House of Commons to make some changes to support the workers so that they don't have to leave the region or suffer through these dead zones. What would be your answer in terms of possible solutions? We would appreciate any suggestions. Well, let me summarize. 420 hours for everybody, whether you're a seasonal worker or not. Pilot project that would have 15 extra weeks in a number of regions that have similar profiles. Just that would help. And just to conclude on that, there's 420 hours to be eligible. And the 14 best weeks, we've had that for a year between 2021 and 2022. What did that cost? $610 million. So $610 million, yes, that's money. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a reform that isn't going to bankrupt the program, and it would help all seasonal workers in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Laliberté. Thank you, Ms. Chabot.
Technical issue I wanted to bring up. I know we're at the end of the meeting. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to note that that at the beginning of this meeting we had Ms. Vienne that was giving her statement and questioning, and I've noticed this quite often where the camera is not on, in particular the first person that's questioning. It was on, she spoke for about 2 minutes, and it was on the chair for the entire time. I've noticed this happening quite frequently, and so I just wanted to bring it up to just go back to technical, especially the camera. Individuals that the first lines of questions are always within 4 people on this side, so it's not like it's a surprise who might be asking. So I just wanted to bring that forward because it was over today because it was almost 2 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Gray, for raising that. Yeah, I could not see that from here, but I think that's a good point. I'll ask the clerk to make sure it's rectified. With that, committee members, next Thursday we meet again. We have 2 ministers appearing next Thursday, and thank you, witnesses, for appearing today. With that, is it the will of the committee to adjourn? Adjourn. Thank you.